I'm one of the best investigative reporters, I think, in the world today.
Full disclosure, this is one of my favorite songs in the world, Paul Simon's Graceland, from his 1986 album by the same name. So for a little bit of quick backstory on the Graceland album, Paul Simon in the mid-80s was experiencing a bit of a professional and personal slump. He had attempted a reunion with Art Garfunkel, however this had fallen apart. His 1983 solo album, Hearts and Bones, had been a critical and commercial disappointment. His tumultuous relationship with second wife Carrie Fisher was deteriorating. His once robust career was cooling down. Like a lot of singer-songwriter musicians from the 70s, the adjustment to the music industry in the 80s wasn't the easiest ride. He was really struggling for creative inspiration. And so, once again, much like the story with Mark Cohn, enter Graceland to get the juices flowing. Famously, one of the contributions of Graceland, the album, was that it featured collaborations between Paul Simon and South African musicians. His good friend Lorne Michaels suggested that he work with a band leader named Heidi Berg. Heidi had been the band leader on Saturday Night Live. So during the time that Paul was in his early stages of collaboration with Heidi, she gave him a cassette tape that she had come in possession of, which was a bootleg recording of South African street musicians. Paul ended up keeping this in his car, kind of listened to it driving around for a while, and he really fell in love with the sound. He fell in love with the idea of incorporating it into his next album. And he believed that in order to really kind of do justice to that influence, instead of trying to recreate that sound in a studio with American musicians, the only way to really get that sound was to travel to South Africa and work with these musicians himself. And honestly, Graceland has been such a revered and beloved album for so long that it's easy to forget that it was very controversial, though it was a very lauded album. So at the time that Graceland was recorded, apartheid was still in effect in South Africa. So in protest of this, the United Nations had put a cultural ban on non-South African artists and entertainers collaborating with South Africans. This seems to have largely been put into effect to prevent entertainers from performing at a luxury resort known as Sun City. Really, no one in the entertainment industry was traveling to South Africa. Paul ignored this to travel to South Africa for 2 weeks, which was the amount of time it took for him to lay down the 8 raw tracks that would eventually become the foundation of the Graceland album. And this was something that people really had mixed feelings about at the time. Now, the album was critically acclaimed, largely embraced by the public. Others felt that in light of the circumstances, he should have made the album more overtly political. Paul Simon responded to this by saying that the album itself was the political statement, that the collaboration itself and the theme of transcendence of racism through music was the statement. Another criticism he had leveled at him at the time were accusations of cultural appropriation. It echoes some of the same criticisms that have been made against Elvis. I think that there's something to be said for Paul Simon's answer there. Part of what he argued happened as a result of the Graceland album was that it brought exposure and subsequent appreciation to these musicians who otherwise wouldn't have been heard in the mainstream, which I also think parallels some of the same accusations that we see leveled against Elvis. So there's a very interesting symmetry. And another thing that kind of builds on that I think is really interesting is learning more about the actual creation of the song Graceland. So when Paul Simon traveled to South Africa to lay these tracks down, he was going about the songwriting process in a different way than he normally did. These songs were built from the ground up. So when he first went to work with these musicians, he had no lyrics, he had no songs. What he wanted to do was to record the music first and then go back and add lyrics to it. So when they laid down the raw track that would eventually become the song Graceland, he had no idea what the song was going to be about. In fact, he said that he went into this with absolutely no intention to write a song about Graceland or Elvis. The song that would go on to become Graceland, he initially had considered calling the Wasteland. So for the parts in the song that later became Graceland, initially intended to say the Wasteland.
April is the cruelest month.
7 hours later.
However, at some point when working on the song, he kind of created as a filler lyric. The phrase, "I'm going to Graceland," popped into his head. And so he used it as a placeholder, but he had every intention of going back and changing the lyric. However, over time, having used that lyric for so long, he eventually reached a point where he became pretty attached to it, and he knew he wasn't going to change it. In fact, what he said was that because that lyric wouldn't leave his head, it eventually became the official lyric. He took that as a sign that there was a reason why this phrase, "I'm going to Graceland," kept repeating in his head. And he felt like the message there was that he needed to go to Graceland. So after recording the tracks in South Africa, he was in New Orleans working on another song for the album, and decided to take the drive to Graceland, which would later become the basis of the lyrics for the song. How Graceland kind of popped up as an idea in his head in the first place. When he and the musicians were working on the song, the South African guitarist that he was working with, Ray Fury, was creating a sound with the guitar that Paul Simon was really drawn to, really curious about. He wasn't using chords that were generally used in South African music. And so when Paul Simon inquired about that, Ray responded that he was trying to approximate a sound that he had heard Paul Simon play. And in addition to that, was also kind of approximating what he remembered American country music sounding like. Paul Simon had this great quote about it where he said, "The beautiful emptiness of that sound," that reminded him of the early Sun Studio recording. And that maybe subliminally was part of what first put him in the mind of Graceland when creating the lyrics. Because of that nod to the Sun Studio sound that Paul Simon heard in the music, organically this theme about Graceland began to develop for this music. And in the vein of that, something that a lot of people note about the song Graceland, it pays homage to Elvis's song Mystery Train. So we kind of see that influence in the song too. So once Paul had decided that at this point he was keeping the Graceland lyric and wanted to go to Graceland to see what this was all about, he took a road trip from New Orleans to Graceland. Now that road trip influences the lyrics to Graceland, but it's not a literal play-by-play. For example, he has pointed out that the narrator in the song is traveling with his 9-year-old son. Now Paul Simon did have a young son at that time who was the child of his first marriage, but his son wasn't on the trip with him. I think that the absolute staggering beauty of the lyrics of Graceland is that, like the best of Paul Simon's work, they're meant to be felt more than understood. Like, this song is really poetry set to music. This narrative about the protagonist of the song, much like Mark Cohn, is taking this pilgrimage to Graceland that takes on spiritual property. This is a narrator who is singing about personal loss, being at a crossroads. He's traveling to Graceland with his son as a means of reconnecting with his son, perhaps seeking redemption. Graceland is both a physical destination and a metaphor. It's both a real place and it's also the state of grace. It's a place of healing, a place of redemption. He describes himself as being somewhat unimpressed, underwhelmed when taking the tour of the mansion. This sort of gave way to something else when he stepped into the meditation garden and found himself at Elvis's grave. He describes himself as becoming completely overwhelmed to the point of tears.
It really puts perspective on things, doesn't it?
No, too much. It's too much fucking perspective now.
So he had this real epiphany when he was there. Like Mark Cohn, Paul Simon was also recognized by the Grammys. Graceland kind of holds a unique distinction. Graceland was recognized as Album of the Year in 1987, and the song had also been nominated for the 1987 Grammy for Song of the Year. It did not win that Grammy. However, the following year in 1988, the song Graceland was nominated for Record of the Year, which it did win. It's making it one of the lowest charting songs ever to win Record of the Year. It's nominated for Grammys 2 separate consecutive years. It really speaks to the chord that this song struck.
It doesn't have to end here. Click on one of the videos below for Elvis and more, and we'd love to have you like, share, and subscribe, and maybe even join so we can put some more gas in this thing.